I never believed in warnings. Not the kind you hear from old folks, not the ones whispered in the dark, and definitely not the ones that sound like urban legends. I always thought I was too rational for that, too grounded in reality. But there's something about 3 a.m. that makes the world feel thinner, like the rules are different, like the things you ignore in the daylight are suddenly waiting for you in the shadows. I learned that the hard way, and now, every time the clock ticks past 2:59, I feel a chill crawl up my spine. It started when I moved into the old house on Willow Lane. I just graduated college, and the world felt wide open, full of possibility and promise. The house was a steel 3 bedrooms, a big yard, and rent so low it felt like a mistake. My friends joked that it was probably haunted, but I laughed it off. I needed a place to start my life, and this was perfect. Or so I thought. The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and tried to make the place feel like home. The neighbors were friendly enough, though a little odd. Mrs. Callahan from next door brought me a casserole the first night and lingered on the porch, her eyes darting to the windows behind me. "You keep your curtains closed at night, dear," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Especially after midnight. And whatever you do, don't look out the window at 3 a.m. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I chalked it up to small-town superstition. I'd grown up in the city, where the only thing you worried about at 3 a.m. was the sound of sirens or the occasional drunk shouting in the street. But Willow Lane was quiet, almost unnaturally so. At night, the silence pressed in on me, thick and heavy, broken only by the creak of the old house settling or the distant hoot of an owl. The first time I woke up at 3 a.m., it was to the sound of tapping. Soft, rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window across the room. I told myself it was just a branch, maybe a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too insistent. I pulled the covers over my head and waited for it to stop. Eventually, it did, and I drifted back to sleep, telling myself it was nothing. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Always at 3 a.m., always the same tapping. I started to dread the hour, watching the clock tick closer and closer, my nerves stretched thin. I tried everything: earplugs, white noise, even moving my bed to the other side of the room. Nothing worked. The tapping always found me. One night, I mentioned it to Mrs. Callahan as she watered her roses. Her hands froze, and she looked at me with something like pity. "You didn't look, did you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, and she let out a shaky breath. "Good. Don't. No matter what you hear, no matter how curious you get, don't look out that window at 3 a.m. I wanted to ask her why, but something in her expression stopped me. It was fear, raw and unfiltered, and it made my skin crawl. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat. That night, I double-checked the locks, closed the curtains tight, and left a lamp on in the hallway. But when 3 a.m. came, the tapping started again, louder this time, more urgent. It felt like it was inside my head, echoing through my bones. Sleep became impossible. I started staying up later and later, trying to outlast the tapping, but it always came. My friends noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at every sound. I told them it was just the stress of moving, of starting a new job, but I could see the doubt in their faces. I stopped inviting them over. The house felt different when I was alone, like it was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. One night, desperate for answers, I searched online for anything about Willow Lane, about the house, about 3 a.m. I found nothing: no ghost stories, no urban legends, just a few old news articles about the neighborhood being built on farmland. But in a forgotten corner of a message board, I found a post from years ago. "If you live on Willow Lane, don't look out your window at 3 a.m. Trust me." There were no replies, no explanation, just that single warning. The next night, the tapping was different. It was faster, more frantic, like someone or something was desperate to get my attention. I lay in bed, frozen, every muscle tense. The urge to look was overwhelming, a physical pull that made my skin itch. I squeezed my eyes shut and counted the seconds, willing the sound to stop. But it didn't. It grew louder, more insistent, until I thought I would go mad. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I lay there, heart racing, afraid to move. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the curtains. I stumbled to the window, half expecting to see scratches or fingerprints, but there was nothing. Just the empty yard, the quiet street, the world unchanged. But I was changed. The fear lingered, a shadow that followed me through the day. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shapes that vanished when I turned. Flickers of movement in the dark. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too many sleepless nights. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next night, I made a decision. I would look. I had to know what was out there, what was causing the tapping, what Mrs. Callahan and the message board and everyone else was so afraid of. I set an alarm for 2:55 a.m., sat in the dark with my back to the window, and waited. I watched the digital clock on my nightstand, the red numbers glowing in the darkness. 2:57. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that it was just a story, just a superstition, just the wind or a branch or a bird. But the house was silent, so silent that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I felt like I was the only person awake in the world. 2:59. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked to the window. The curtains were drawn tight, the fabric heavy and thick. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the edge. For a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to go back to bed, to pretend I'd never heard the tapping. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and fear can be even more persuasive. I took a deep breath and pulled the curtain aside just a crack. The street outside was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. The trees cast long, twisted shadows across the lawn. Everything looked normal, almost peaceful. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. There was nothing there. No monsters, no ghosts, just my overactive imagination. I was about to let the curtain fall back into place when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder now, coming from directly in front of me. I pressed my face closer to the glass, squinting into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, slowly, a shape began to materialize on the other side of the window. It was faint, almost transparent, like a reflection that didn't belong to me. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it didn't go away. It grew clearer, more defined, until I could make out the outline of a face. It was a woman, or at least, it looked like one. Her skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Her eyes were wide and dark, staring straight at me. Her hair hung in limp, tangled strands around her face. She pressed her hand against the glass, her fingers long and thin, leaving smudges on the pane. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The curtain slipped from my fingers, falling back into place. I stood there, frozen, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing. The tapping started again, softer this time, almost pleading. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and listen. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and fascination. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. The silence was worse. I forced myself to move, to step away from the window, to crawl back into bed and pull the covers over my head. I lay there, shaking, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were filled with images of the woman's face, her eyes boring into mine, her mouth moving in silent warning. The next day, I tried to convince myself it hadn't happened. I told myself it was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But when I went to the window, I saw the smudges, 5 long, thin fingerprints pressed into the glass. I scrubbed them away, but they left faint marks, as if the glass itself had been scarred. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. Who was she? What did she want? Why was she at my window? I remembered Mrs. Callahan's warning, the fear in her eyes, the urgency in her voice. I wondered if she had seen the woman too. That evening, I saw Mrs. Callahan in her garden, pruning her roses. I walked over, trying to act casual, but my hands were shaking. "Did you ever see anything strange?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You looked, didn't you?" she said, her voice flat. I nodded, unable to speak. She sighed, setting her shears aside. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "Once you see her, she doesn't go away. She keeps coming back every night until..." She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the window of my bedroom. "Until what?" I asked, my voice trembling. She shook her head. "Just keep your curtains closed. Don't look again. No matter what you hear, no matter how much she begs, don't look." I wanted to ask more, but she turned away, her shoulders hunched, her hands trembling. I watched her disappear into her house, the door closing softly behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at my own front door, wondering what I had gotten myself into. That night, I closed the curtains tight, wedged a chair under the doorknob, and left every light in the house on. But when 3 a.m. came, the tapping started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, my eyes squeezed shut. The urge to look was overwhelming, a physical ache in my chest. I bit my lip, digging my nails into my palms, willing myself to stay put. But then I heard her voice. Soft, muffled, coming from the other side of the glass. "Please," she whispered. "Let me in. I'm so cold. Please." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it seeped through, filling the room, filling my head. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear. Eventually, the voice faded, replaced by silence. When the sun rose, I stumbled to the window, my legs weak. The smudges were back, clearer this time, as if she had pressed her face against the glass, leaving a faint outline of her features. I didn't sleep the next night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those hollow, pleading eyes, the way her mouth moved in silent desperation. I tried to distract myself, scrolling endlessly through my phone, watching mindless videos, anything to keep my mind off the window. But as the hours crept by, the house seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. I kept glancing at the clock, dreading the moment when the numbers would flip to 3 o'clock. At 2:45, I made myself a cup of coffee, the bitter taste sharp on my tongue. I sat at the kitchen table, every light blazing, and tried to convince myself that I was safe. But the house felt different now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I thought about calling someone, my parents, a friend, anyone, but what would I say? That I was being haunted by a woman at my window? That I was afraid to look outside? I could already hear the laughter, the disbelief. So I sat alone, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the distant creak of the old floorboards. At 2:59, I heard the first tap. It was so soft I almost missed it, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I set my coffee down, my hands shaking, and stared at the ceiling. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty house. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The tapping was inside me now, vibrating in my bones. Then came the voice. "Please," she whispered, her words muffled by the glass. "Please, I'm so cold. Let me in." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing her to go away, but the voice grew louder, more desperate. "Please, I'm so lonely. I just want to come inside. Please." The words twisted in my mind, filling me with a strange mix of fear and pity. What if she really was lost, trapped outside, needing help? What if I was the only one who could save her? I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked to the foot of the stairs. I could see the faint outline of the window at the end of the hallway, the curtains drawn tight. The tapping grew frantic, the voice rising in pitch. Please, please, please. I took a step forward, then another, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. My hand reached out, trembling, and brushed against the curtain. I stopped. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to hide. But I couldn't move. I was caught between fear and curiosity, between the urge to help and the need to protect myself. I thought of Mrs. Callahan, her warning, the terror in her eyes. I thought of the message board, the single line of text, "Don't look out your window at 3 a.m. Trust me." I thought of the smudges on the glass, the outline of her face. I let my hand fall to my side and backed away, step by step, until I was in my bedroom again. I crawled into bed, pulled the covers over my head, and waited for the sun to rise. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, but I didn't move. I didn't look. When morning came, I found new smudges on the window, darker this time, as if she had pressed her whole body against the glass. The days blurred together. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped answering my phone. My friends left messages, worried about me, but I couldn't bring myself to call them back. I was trapped in a cycle of fear and exhaustion, counting down the hours until 3 a.m., dreading the moment when the tapping would start again. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing, and peered through the peephole. It was Mrs. Callahan, her face drawn and pale. I opened the door, and she stepped inside without a word, her eyes scanning the room. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, and waited for me to sit across from her. "You looked again, didn't you?" she said quietly. I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I told you not to. Once you see her, she never leaves. She'll keep coming back, every night, until you let her in. Or until..." She trailed off, her eyes distant. "Until what?" I whispered. Mrs. Callahan hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "Until she finds someone else. Someone new. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." She looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm sorry. I wish I could help you, but I can't. No one can." She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "Keep your curtains closed. Don't answer the window. Don't listen to her. No matter what she says, no matter how much she begs, don't let her in." She paused at the door, her hand on the knob. "And if you see anyone new move in, warn them. It's the only thing you can do." She left without another word, the door closing softly behind her. I sat at the table, staring at the empty chair, feeling more alone than ever. The house felt colder, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. I wondered how many others had seen her, how many had listened, how many had let her in. That night, I closed the curtains tight, wedged a chair under the doorknob, and left every light in the house on. But when 3 a.m. came, the tapping started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, my eyes squeezed shut. The urge to look was overwhelming, a physical ache in my chest. I bit my lip, digging my nails into my palms, willing myself to stay put. But then I heard her voice. Soft, muffled, coming from the other side of the glass. "Please," she whispered. "Let me in. I'm so cold. Please." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it seeped through, filling the room, filling my head. I tried to hold out, but the voice was relentless. It wasn't just pleading anymore, it was angry, desperate, a raw edge of pain in every word. "You saw me. You know I'm here. Why won't you help me?" The tapping became pounding, shaking the glass in its frame. I pressed my pillow over my head, but the sound vibrated through the mattress, through the floor, through my bones. I could feel her presence on the other side of the window, a cold weight pressing against the house, seeping into the walls. I don't know how long it lasted. Time lost all meaning in those hours between midnight and dawn. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft and shuffling, as if someone was pacing outside my door. Other times, I heard sobbing, low and broken, echoing through the vents. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, if the sleepless nights and constant fear were finally catching up to me. The next morning, I found something new. On the windowsill, just beneath the glass, was a single strand of hair, long, dark, and tangled. I stared at it for a long time, my hands shaking. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know if it was real. I left it there, a silent reminder that she was getting closer. I tried to go about my day as if nothing was wrong. I went to work, made small talk with my coworkers, smiled and nodded at the right times. But I could feel the exhaustion dragging at me, pulling me under. I caught myself staring out windows, flinching at every reflection, every shadow. I started to see her everywhere, in the glass of the office door, in the rearview mirror, in the puddles on the street after it rained. Always watching, always waiting. One evening, as I was leaving work, I saw a moving truck parked in front of the house across the street. A young couple was unloading boxes, laughing and joking as they carried their things inside. I felt a surge of panic, remembering Mrs. Callahan's words, "If you see anyone new move in, warn them." I hesitated, unsure of what to say, how to explain. But as I watched them disappear into their new home, I knew I had to try. That night, I baked a batch of cookies, something to break the ice, something to make me seem less crazy. I walked across the street, my hands trembling, and rang the doorbell. The woman answered, her face bright and open. "Hi. You must be our neighbor," she said, smiling. I forced a smile in return, holding out the cookies. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, my voice shaking. "I just wanted to say, if you ever hear anything strange at night, especially around 3 a.m., just keep your curtains closed. Don't look out the window." Her smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. "Is there something we should know?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder at her husband. I shook my head, feeling foolish. "It's probably nothing. Just an old superstition, I guess." I handed her the cookies and hurried back across the street, my face burning with embarrassment. That night, the tapping was worse than ever. It started earlier, just after midnight, and didn't stop. The voice was louder, angrier, the words twisted with rage. "You told them. You warned them. Why won't you help me?" The glass rattled in its frame, the walls shook, the lights flickered. I curled up in bed, clutching my pillow, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to make it stop. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to the sound of birds outside my window. The sun was shining, the world was bright and normal. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. But when I looked at the window, I saw new smudges, new fingerprints, and another strand of hair on the sill. I started to avoid my house as much as possible. I stayed late at work, wandered the aisles of the grocery store, sat in my car in the driveway until I couldn't keep my eyes open. But no matter how long I stayed away, I always had to come home. And every night, at 3 a.m., the tapping would start again. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and drove to a motel on the edge of town. I checked in, double-locked the door, and closed the curtains tight. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the tapping. But the room was silent. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. When I returned home the next morning, the house felt different. Colder, emptier, as if something had been waiting for me. I found the window open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. On the floor beneath the window was a puddle of water, and in the center of the puddle was a single, perfect handprint. I called Mrs. Callahan, my voice shaking. She came over, her face pale and drawn. She looked at the handprint, then at me. "She's getting stronger," she said quietly. "The longer you resist, the more desperate she becomes. You have to be careful. She'll do anything to get inside." I wanted to ask her what would happen if I let the woman in, but I was afraid of the answer. Instead, I cleaned up the water, closed the window, and taped the curtains shut. I sat in the living room, every light on, waiting for the night to fall. That evening, I tried to distract myself with television, but every show seemed distant, the voices muffled, the colors washed out. My mind kept drifting back to the window, to the handprint, to the way the air in the house felt heavier, as if it were pressing down on me. I jumped at every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog. I kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes slip away, dreading the approach of midnight. I thought about calling my parents, but what would I say? That I was being haunted by a woman who appeared at my window every night? That I was afraid to sleep, afraid to look outside, afraid to even be in my own home? I imagined their voices, full of concern and confusion, and I couldn't bring myself to dial the number. Instead, I sat in the living room, knees pulled to my chest, listening to the silence. At 11:30, I heard footsteps on the porch. My heart leapt into my throat. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. It was the young couple from across the street, the ones I'd tried to warn. The woman was crying, her husband's arm around her shoulders. I opened the door, and they rushed inside, their faces pale and drawn. "Did you see her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She was at our window," she sobbed. "She kept tapping, kept asking to come in. We didn't know what to do. We closed the curtains, but she wouldn't stop." Her husband looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "What is she? Why is she here?" I shook my head, feeling helpless. "I don't know. She's been coming to my window for weeks. I tried to warn you, but..." My voice broke, and I looked away. The woman clung to her husband, her body shaking with sobs. "We can't go back there," she whispered. "We can't." I let them stay the night, setting up blankets and pillows on the living room floor. We sat together in the dim light, listening to the house settle, waiting for the tapping to start. At 3 a.m., it came louder than ever, echoing through the walls, rattling the windows. The woman buried her face in her husband's chest, sobbing. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere, inside and out. The voice followed, soft at first, then rising in pitch. "Please, let me in. I'm so cold. I'm so lonely. Please." The words twisted through the air, wrapping around us like a shroud. I could see the fear in the couple's eyes, the way they clung to each other, desperate for comfort. I wanted to tell them it would be okay, that it would stop, but I couldn't lie. I didn't know if it would ever stop. When the sun finally rose, the tapping faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The couple left, their faces drawn and exhausted, promising to call a realtor first thing in the morning. I watched them cross the street, their shoulders hunched, their steps hurried. I wondered if they would ever find peace, or if the woman at the window would follow them wherever they went. I spent the day cleaning, scrubbing every surface, trying to erase any trace of her presence. But the house still felt wrong, as if it belonged to someone else. I found more strands of hair, more smudges on the glass, more puddles of water on the floor. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, if the fear and exhaustion were making me see things that weren't there. That night, I sat in the living room, every light on, the curtains taped shut. I tried to stay awake, but my eyes grew heavy, my head nodding. I jerked awake to the sound of tapping so loud it felt like it was coming from inside the house. I stumbled to my feet, heart racing, and crept down the hallway. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if she were pounding on every window, every door. I pressed my back against the wall, sliding down to the floor. I covered my ears, squeezed my eyes shut, and tried to block out the sound. But then I heard her voice, right next to me, as if she were whispering in my ear. "Please. I just want to come inside. I just want to be warm. Please." I started to cry, the fear and exhaustion finally breaking through. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. The voice was silent for a moment, then softer, almost gentle. "I want to come home. I want to be safe. Please." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I can't. I'm sorry. I can't. The tapping stopped, replaced by a deep, aching silence. I sat there for a long time, listening to the sound of my own breathing, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the house settling. When the sun rose, I found the window in the living room wide open, the curtains billowing in the breeze. On the floor was a puddle of water, and in the center of the puddle was a single, perfect footprint. I stared at the footprint for a long time, unable to move. It was small, almost childlike, but the toes were too long, the arch too high. The water around it was icy cold, soaking into the floorboards, leaving a dark stain that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. I knelt down, reaching out with trembling fingers, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the scent of salt and something older, something rotten. I backed away, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I called in sick to work that day. I couldn't face the world, couldn't pretend that everything was normal. I wandered from room to room, checking every window, every door, making sure they were locked tight. But it didn't matter. She could get in whenever she wanted. The house was hers now, not mine. I was just a guest, a trespasser in my own life. I tried to call Mrs. Callahan, but she didn't answer. I left a message, my voice shaking, begging her to call me back. I thought about the couple across the street, wondered if they'd made it through the night, if they were packing their things, if they were already gone. I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden. I had tried to warn them, but it hadn't been enough. It was never enough. As the day wore on, the sky grew dark and heavy, clouds rolling in from the west. Rain began to fall, tapping against the windows, a steady, relentless rhythm that set my nerves on edge. I sat in the living room, staring at the clock, watching the minutes crawl by. I tried to distract myself with books, with music, with anything that might drown out the sound of the rain. But nothing worked. The house was too quiet, the silence too deep. At dusk, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing, and crept to the peephole. It was Mrs. Callahan, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. I opened the door, and she stepped inside, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry I didn't answer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was afraid. We sat together in the kitchen, the rain pounding against the windows. She told me about the first time she saw the woman, years ago, when she was just a girl. "My mother warned me, just like I warned you," she said, her eyes distant. "She said there was something in this place, something that waited for people to be alone, to be vulnerable. She said it would come to the window at 3 a.m., tapping, whispering, begging to be let in. And if you looked, if you listened, it would never leave you alone." I asked her if anyone had ever let the woman in. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Once. When I was a teenager, a boy down the street, he was always curious, always looking for trouble. He laughed at the stories, said they were just old wives' tales. One night, he looked. The next morning, he was gone. His parents found the window open, water on the floor, footprints leading out into the yard. They never found him." A chill ran through me, cold and sharp. "What does she want?" I whispered. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. "No one knows. Some say she's looking for someone to take her place. Others say she's lost, trapped between worlds, desperate for warmth, for company. All I know is that once you see her, she never lets go." We sat in silence, the rain drumming against the house. I wanted to ask her what I should do, how I could make it stop, but I already knew the answer. There was nothing I could do. The only thing left was to endure, to survive, to hope that someday, somehow, she would move on. That night, Mrs. Callahan stayed with me. We sat in the living room, every light on, the curtains taped shut. We talked about everything and nothing: her garden, my job, the weather, the way the world seemed to change after midnight. As the clock crept closer to 3 a.m., the air in the room grew colder, the shadows deeper. We held hands, our fingers intertwined, waiting for the tapping to start. When it came, it was softer than before, almost gentle. Tap, tap, tap. The voice followed, a whisper on the edge of hearing. "Please, Let me in. I'm so cold. I'm so lonely. Please. Mrs. Callahan squeezed my hand, her eyes squeezed shut, her lips moving in silent prayer. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere, inside and out. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, the voice rising in pitch. Please. 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 The lights flickered, the walls shook, the air filled with the scent of salt and decay. I felt something brush against my cheek, cold and wet, like a hand reaching out from the darkness. I screamed, pulling away, but Mrs. Callahan held me tight, her arms strong and steady. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence was absolute, crushing. We sat together, trembling, waiting for the dawn. When the first light crept through the curtains, we let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through us. Mrs. Callahan left at sunrise, her face drawn and exhausted. Be careful, she said, her voice barely audible. She's getting stronger. Don't let her in. No matter what. The house felt emptier after Mrs. Callahan left, as if her presence had been the last barrier between me and whatever waited in the darkness. I wandered from room to room, every window sealed, every curtain taped shut, but I could still feel her just beyond the glass, patient, relentless. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. I sat in the living room, lights blazing, clutching a mug of cold coffee, listening to the silence press in. At exactly 3 a.m., the tapping began again. This time, I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just stared at the clock, counting each second, refusing to give in. The voice came, softer than before, almost mournful. Please. I just want to come home. I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my cheeks, and whispered, no. The tapping faded, replaced by a deep, aching quiet. When dawn finally broke, I stood and opened the front door. The world outside was unchanged, birds singing, sunlight glinting off dew. But I knew I was different. I had survived another night. And as I watched the empty street, I realized I would keep surviving, one night at a time, never looking out the window at 3 a.m. again. If you've ever felt that urge to peek into the darkness, remember my story. And if you want more chilling tales like this, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share your own experiences below. Stay safe and keep your curtains closed.